I'm here at the Beef Stalker Field Day at Kansas State University with Dr. Terry Mader from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And you talked a lot about heat stress in cattle, and there are other factors besides temperature that influence heat stress. Can you discuss those?
Absolutely. Well, the contributing factor, you have two things that balance heat stress. It's the environmental and the metabolic. And so high producing animals consuming a lot of feed have a high metabolic heat load. And so when we have heat stress or hot days, they have to balance that with the environmental heat stress.
How does shade come into play when you're trying to consider how to minimize heat stress in cattle?
Well, obviously we all are more comfortable in the shade than not in the shade. The thing about shade is it's in relation to the type of cattle that we're producing. Generally we like to have dark-hided or black-hided cattle, nothing wrong with that, but they tend to absorb more solar heat. So they tend to be our best candidates for shade in the summer. On the flip side of that, or the opposite side, dark-hided cattle are beneficial in the winter because, again, they absorb more sunshine and more solar heat. But shade does play a big part. It doesn't alter the temperature underneath the shade, but it just cuts down or decreases that feels like temperature, which in the summer can be as much as 10 to 20 degrees added on to the ambient temperature. So it might be 100 degrees without shade. It'll feel like 120. With shade, it'll feel like 100.
How much shade do you recommend?
Well, I have a rough rule of thumb, about 2 square feet per 100 pounds of body weight. So a 1,000-pound animal need about 20 square feet. 1,500-pound animal, again, getting in like a dairy size animal, 30 square feet or more during the summer.
And what livestock are more susceptible to heat stress?
Well, again, you get back to the high-producing animals. Generally, animals with high body condition, so the feedlot cattle tend to be most susceptible as far as the range of cattle. The dairy animal comes in, the milk-producing animals come in next, and then animals that are, any animals that are in close confinement, where they may be don't have good air movement, and so that could be poultry, swine. And then typically cattle out on the range are less susceptible, but they're still affected because you generally are the ones that don't have really access to any management or mitigation strategy to help them deal with it.
What kind of measures can producers take to minimize heat stress in their cattle?
Well, we've already talked about shade. Some of the things they're doing in the feedlot, they may alter the feeding period or feeding time. We can use sprinklers. One of the really easy, in my opinion, and simpler methods is to, particularly in an area where we have cattle in confinement and there's a bare ground, just go in with a water truck and wet the ground down, and that'll cool that surface. And then for any animal out on the range or in the feedlot, add more watering points or more watering capacity so that they don't have to compete for that watering space. And that way any animal, the dominant ones and the timid ones, can get the water and drink all they need. And if I can get cool water in those animals, I have a pretty good chance of dealing with most any type of heat stress that we're exposed to.
And what are some of those identifying factors that producers can really look for in identifying if an animal is heat stressed?
Well, we've developed an index, what I call a panning score index, and it's really easy to use. And the way we use it is we go out and observe animals, say mid-morning, and if they're showing some of these signs, well, then we need to initiate a mitigation process. But one of the most obvious signs of an animal starting to get into a moderate heat stress scenario is that when you look at him, there'll be little bits of drool coming around one or both sides of his mouth. And what he's doing, he's opening his mouth to get a little more air in when he's panning. But at that same process, he's not swallowing all the saliva. We go through the same process, we just don't drool. But anyway, if they're not swallowing that saliva, well, then it starts to show. And again, that's an early sign that they're under heat stress. And then the foam and the open mouth and the tongue sticking out is full-blown heat stress.
And what other heat stress contributors should producers watch out for? You mentioned parasites and other things can really add to the stress of the animal.
Probably one of the biggest ones that we have with heat stress are the biting flies. Sometimes the face flies and horn flies are a bit of an aggravation, but the deer fly and the biting fly, any biting fly is a significant aggravation of these animals. And what happens is they will crowd together to try to keep that fly population to the outside, but in that same time, particularly animals out on the range, that crowding together produces a high heat load in the middle of that mob because they can't dissipate heat. So that is a huge problem that we want to try to manage. And you know, watering points, how far do they have to travel? If it's hot, don't process or don't work the cattle or don't move the cattle. And then in the county fairs and the state fairs, you just have to be aware of, are they getting enough water? Don't leave them tied up out in the sun in the middle of the day and no wind or no breeze. They need the breeze. And then there are periods of time where it's just the conditions are so unbearable that you really need to have the show another time.
And you mentioned that heat stress has become more of an issue recently. Can you talk as why that's the case?
Well, the animal welfare issue is a concern, and we've got beef quality assurance and pork quality assurance, and so the livestock producers, we're really trying to get a grasp on what are definable, acceptable management regimens to maintain good health, animal health and well-being. And for the most part, we're doing a great job. It's these adverse weather events that we're really struggling with. We may have an emergency plan, but if you haven't used it for a year, it's rarely implemented at the right time or the right way. And so, again, the weather events, and heaven knows we've had enough of them, are the ones that really catch us off guard. And so we get animals that are exposed to situations and conditions that, had we had a little more forethought or a little better plan, it could have been avoided, to make sure that we don't stress the animal too much or compromise the animal. Again, that's not out of the question. They do get compromised if we don't have the right plan. We have all the issues with heat stress. We have an opposite scenario with cold stress, and again, like I said today, that's another presentation, but we go through some of the same things, the snowstorms, the high winds, and clearly the change in the season, they're going from warm to cold, and then when that's combined with a wet snow or a wet rain, then we really get animals that can be compromised. And so we need to be aware of that and then take the measures to manage that appropriately.
Very good. Well, good information from Dr. Terry Mader from the University of Nebraska here at the Kansas Beef Stalker Field Day. I'm Katie Allen reporting for Ag AM of Kansas.